The Unlikely Kingmaker, William Adams in Feudal Japan. On a storm-battered spring morning in 1600, a half-dead Englishman stumbled onto the shores of feudal Japan. His body was ravaged by scurvy, his clothes little more than salt-crusted rags. Of the 110 men who had set sail with him from Rotterdam 2 years earlier, only 23 remained alive. In any other era, William Adams, shipwright, sailor, and survivor, would have been executed on the spot as a foreign barbarian. Instead, he was about to become the most unlikely kingmaker in Japanese history. What followed was a transformation so extraordinary that it would have been dismissed as fiction had it not been meticulously documented in letters, diplomatic records, and the journals of astonished European traders. The shipwrecked English sailor would rise to become Miura Anjin, the blue-eyed samurai, trusted confidant to the most powerful warlord in Japan. His story bridges two worlds that had never truly met, a tale of survival and reinvention that would help shape the fate of nations. This is the story of how a common man from Kent became the architect of Japan's first navy, the founder of its first foreign trading ports, and the samurai who changed an empire. The Maritime journey of William Adams. The Thames River of William Adams' childhood was a forest of masts. Dutch flyboats, Portuguese carracks, and English merchantmen crowded the waterways of Elizabethan London, their rigging creating a web of rope and canvas that blotted out the sky. For a boy born in the shipbuilding heart of Kent, these vessels were more than mere transportation. They were living creatures of wood and hemp, each with its own personality and secrets. The year of Adams' birth, 1564, marked the peak of England's maritime revolution. The same waters that would later carry him to Japan were then churning with possibilities as Elizabeth R's kingdom transformed itself from a medieval backwater into a seafaring empire. In the muddy dockyards of Gillingham, where young William spent his days watching shipwrights shape massive oak timbers into vessels capable of crossing oceans, the future was being carved one adze stroke at a time. His father, John Adams, died when William was 12, leaving him with little more than a name and an apprenticeship to Nicholas Diggins, master shipwright of the Royal Dockyards at Chatham. It was here, amid the acrid smell of pine tar and the relentless rhythm of hammers, that Adams developed the practical genius that would later astonish the Japanese. Diggins was known for his innovative designs, pushing the boundaries of what English ships could achieve. Under his tutelage, Adams learned not just to build ships, but to understand their souls, how a slight change in the curve of a hull could mean the difference between sailing and sinking in heavy seas. The education of a shipwright in Tudor England was far more than mere carpentry. Adams absorbed mathematics from the geometry of hull design, physics from the interaction of wind and sail, and astronomy from the navigation requirements of deep-sea vessels. By day, he worked with his hands in the yard, but in the evenings he devoured books on navigation and cartography borrowed from the pilots who frequented Chatham's waterfront taverns. These men brought tales of the Spanish Main, the frozen Arctic, and the mysterious Indies, stories that painted pictures of worlds beyond the Thames. Yet it was the daily drama of the dockyards that truly shaped him. Adams witnessed firsthand the building of ships that would later fight the Spanish Armada. He watched as England's shipwrights incorporated revolutionary design elements stolen from captured Spanish prizes, and learned the secret techniques that made English ships the most maneuverable in Europe. In the cramped workshops where craftsmen labored over elaborate stern carvings and gun ports, he gained an appreciation for both the art and science of shipbuilding that would later prove invaluable halfway across the world. By his 16th birthday, Adams had developed a reputation as a prodigy. His designs showed an intuitive grasp of hydrodynamics that seasoned shipwrights twice his age struggled to match. But it was his restlessness that set him apart, a burning curiosity about the vessels he helped create. While other apprentices were content to remain in the safety of the dockyards, Adams spent every free moment questioning sailors about their voyages, memorizing charts, and studying the secrets of celestial navigation. The ships he helped build were destined for adventures he could only imagine until the day he decided that building them was no longer enough. In the autumn of 1580, as London's shipyards prepared for winter, Adams made the decision that would alter not just his own destiny, but the course of two nations. He would go to sea. The boy who had learned to shape ships would learn to master them, setting in motion a chain of events that would eventually carry him to the farthest edges of the known world. The Thames that had been his teacher would become his road to adventure, though even in his wildest dreams he could not have imagined where that road would lead. From craftsmen to mariners, Adams' maritime journey. The Royal Navy of 1580 was a crucible that transformed craftsmen into warriors. Fresh from his apprenticeship, Adams found himself thrust into a maritime world crackling with tension. Spanish gold fleets tempted English privateers, while Protestant and Catholic ships clashed in running battles across the Channel. For a young man who had spent his life building vessels, learning to fight them was a harsh education. His first command came during a merchant run to the Barbary coast, a simple trading voyage that erupted into violence when Turkish corsairs attempted to board their vessel off Morocco. Adams' intimate knowledge of ship construction proved decisive. Understanding exactly where to target the enemy vessel's weakest points, he directed his gunners with surgical precision. The corsairs retreated, and Adams's reputation as both a sailor and tactician began to grow. Marriage to Mary Hinn in 1585 should have anchored him to London's shores, but the sea's call proved stronger. While Mary established a respectable household in Limehouse, Adams embarked on increasingly ambitious voyages. He navigated the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean, mastered the Atlantic trade winds, and slowly built a network of contacts among Europe's merchant houses. Each return to port brought new scars and stories, and more importantly, a growing fascination with reports of untapped markets in the Far East. The Dutch East India Company's offer in 1598 arrived at precisely the right moment. The Portuguese and Spanish monopoly on Asian trade was weakening, and Dutch merchants were scrambling to establish new routes to the Spice Islands. They needed pilots who could combine navigational skill with practical ship knowledge, men capable of both finding new passages and keeping their vessels afloat in unknown waters. Adams, with his unique combination of shipwright's wisdom and sailor's experience, was an ideal candidate. 5 ships were being prepared in Rotterdam for the most ambitious Dutch expedition yet attempted. The flagship, Liefde, represented the pinnacle of European shipbuilding technology. Adams spent weeks inspecting her construction, suggesting modifications to her rigging and hull that would prove crucial in the Pacific storms ahead. As he worked, he copied detailed notes about her design into a personal journal, observations that would later revolutionize Japanese shipbuilding. The expedition promised both fortune and danger in equal measure. Spanish warships patrolled the tropical seas, ready to destroy any Protestant vessel that dared intrude on their trading empire. Maps of the Pacific were largely blank, marked only with vague warnings and mythical monsters. Yet it was precisely this uncertainty that drew Adams. Here was a chance to combine everything he had learned as both builder and sailor to test himself against the greatest challenges the sea could offer. On June 24, 1598, Adams kissed his wife goodbye on the Rotterdam docks. Mary was pregnant with their second child, a son he would not meet for 2 decades. As the Liefde's sails filled with wind and the Dutch coast faded into the horizon, Adams could not have known he was sailing into legend. He was leaving behind one world in search of fortune in another, but fate had a far grander destiny in mind for the shipwright's son from Kent. Voyage of peril and discovery. The Magellan Straits swallowed ships whole. As the Liefde and her sister vessels approached the southern tip of America in 1599, they faced a graveyard of broken hulls and shattered dreams. The channel that snaked between towering cliffs was a maze of hidden reefs and murderous currents. Worse still, winter was approaching. In these latitudes, that meant 20 hours of darkness and storms that could shred canvas to ribbons. Spanish galleons lurked in the shadows of every cove. 2 weeks into the passage, they struck. The battle lasted 6 hours, fought in driving sleet that froze to the gunwales. When it was over, the Liefde's sister ship Hope lay burning in the strait, her crew taken prisoner. Another vessel, the Faith, vanished in the darkness, never to be seen again. Adams watched from the quarterdeck as the wreckage of his fleet was swallowed by the frigid waters, knowing that retreat was now impossible. The Pacific proved even more merciless. For 8 months, the surviving ships battled their way north through storms that defied description. Canvas froze solid. Waves tall as cathedral spires crashed over the decks. The Charity disappeared in a typhoon off the coast of Chile, while the Love turned back, leaving the Liefde alone in waters no European ship had ever successfully crossed. Scurvy struck with devastating efficiency. Adams watched helplessly as veteran sailors were reduced to shambling specters, their teeth falling out, their wounds refusing to heal. The ship's surgeon went mad, claiming he could see golden cities floating in the clouds. When he died, they found his logbook filled with increasingly desperate attempts to find a cure, the last entries written in his own blood. Navigation became a nightmare of guesswork and prayer. Their charts showed nothing but vast empty spaces marked with warnings about sea monsters and perpetual storms. The ship's compass began spinning wildly. They had sailed into regions where normal magnetic rules no longer applied. Adams relied on the stars when he could see them, but for weeks at a time the sky remained hidden behind banks of towering clouds. Late in 1599, they spotted an island that appeared on no known map. Desperate for fresh water and food, they approached the coast. But as they drew closer, the island began to move. It was smoke from an underwater volcano just beginning to breach the surface. The heat was so intense it blistered the paint on the Liefde's hull. They fled north, but the encounter left the crew convinced they had sailed beyond the edge of God's creation into waters ruled by demons. By April 1600, only 23 of the original crew remained alive. The Liefde was barely seaworthy. Her timbers sprung from countless storms, her sails patched so many times they were more repair than original canvas. When a mountainous coastline finally emerged from the morning mist, no one was certain whether they were seeing Japan or a final hallucination. It wasn't until a fishing boat cautiously approached that Adams dared to believe they had actually found the legendary island empire. They had sailed into a world where all their charts, letters of introduction, and European assumptions were worthless. As Adams stepped onto Japanese soil for the first time, he was no longer a respected pilot or shipwright, but an alien creature whose very existence violated centuries of isolation. His only assets were his wits, his technical knowledge, and an iron determination to survive. It would have to be enough. In the Shadow of the Shogun, the story of William Adams. The Portuguese Jesuits arrived at Adams' cell with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. As translators between the Japanese authorities and the surviving crew, they held the power of life and death over the English pilot. Their recommendation could mean either execution or mercy. But Adams, delirious with scurvy and fever, immediately recognized the fear beneath their practiced diplomacy. His arrival threatened decades of carefully cultivated Portuguese influence in Japan, and they meant to eliminate that threat. "Tell them he's a pirate," the lead Jesuit whispered to his colleague in Portuguese, not realizing Adams had picked up the language during his Mediterranean trading days. "Tell them the English are all pirates and heretics." It was the first move in a deadly game of cultural chess that would define the next 3 years of Adams' life. The summons to meet Tokugawa Ieyasu came during cherry blossom season. Japan's most powerful warlord was busy consolidating his grip on the nation, but rumors of the strange blue-eyed barbarian who spoke of navigation and shipbuilding had piqued his interest. Adams was marched inland to Osaka Castle, a towering edifice of stone and gold that made the Tower of London look like a country manor. Their first meeting lasted 6 hours. Through Portuguese translators who deliberately mistranslated his words, Adams explained European shipbuilding techniques, navigation methods, and trade relations. Ieyasu's questions were precise, technical, and relentless. He demanded details about cannon casting, fortress design, and the political balance of European powers. When Adams drew shipping diagrams in the castle's dust, the shogun's eyes lit up with an intensity that made his attendants step back in alarm. The Portuguese missionaries' campaign against Adams backfired spectacularly. Every accusation of piracy led to questions about European naval tactics. Each denunciation of his Protestant faith sparked discussions about the religious wars dividing Europe. Wars that suggested Portuguese Catholics might not be the most reliable allies. Adams turned his interrogation into a masterclass on European power politics, with himself as the objective observer. While imprisoned between audiences with Ieyasu, Adams devoted himself to learning Japanese. He had always had a gift for languages, but this was unlike anything he'd encountered. Every word had layers of meaning tied to social status. Every gesture carried significance that could mean the difference between honor and insult. He learned by listening to his guards, by watching the complex dance of court etiquette, by making mistakes that could have cost him his head. The turning point came during a conversation about astronomy. Adams explained the European understanding of planetary motion, sketching diagrams that closely matched Japanese scholarly texts nobody realized had reached the West. Ieyasu, himself a secret scholar of scientific works, recognized in Adams something far more valuable than a simple navigator. He had found a bridge between two worlds. In 1603, as Ieyasu prepared to declare himself shogun and absolute ruler of Japan, he made a decision that shocked his court. The blue-eyed barbarian would be freed and given official status. Adams had transformed himself from prisoner to valuable asset, but his greatest challenge lay ahead. He would have to navigate the treacherous waters of Japanese politics while helping to chart his adopted nation's course into a new era. The shipwright's son from Kent was about to help reshape an empire. The transformation of William Adams, Anjin-sama in Japan, 1603 to 1610, the first Western-style ship built in Japan, took shape in the summer of 1604. As Adams directed Japanese craftsmen in the unfamiliar art of European shipbuilding, crowds gathered daily to watch the strange vessel emerge from the timber. The design he'd sketched for Ieyasu combined English hull architecture with modifications for Japanese waters, a hybrid creation that symbolized Adams' own transformation. When launched, the 80-ton vessel sailed like nothing the Japanese had ever seen, tacking against winds that would have left traditional junks becalmed. Ieyasu's gift of a country estate made Adams the first foreigner to become a hatamoto, a direct retainer of the shogun. The title came with lands, servants, and 2 swords that marked him as a samurai. But it also carried a hidden message: he could never leave Japan. His knowledge was too valuable, his influence too great. The same expertise that had won him freedom now bound him with golden chains to his adopted homeland. Marriage to Oyuki, daughter of a noble family, cemented his new identity. While his English wife Mary remained a painful memory, Oyuki became his bridge into the labyrinthine world of Japanese social relations. She taught him the unspoken language of court politics, when to speak, when to remain silent, how to turn ritual into advantage. Their union produced 2 children who embodied the merging of East and West. Joseph and Susanna Adams, raised as Japanese nobility, but carrying their father's English blood. The Dutch trading post at Hirado rose from Adams' negotiations with his former shipmates. As the only foreigner with the shogun's ear, he wielded influence that made the Portuguese missionaries seethe with frustration. European traders now had to go through Anjin-sama, the honorable pilot, to access Japanese markets. Adams used this power carefully, balancing English and Dutch interests against Portuguese monopolies, always ensuring that Japan held the stronger position. Shipyards along the coast began incorporating Adams' innovations into their designs. Japanese craftsmen, already masters of woodwork, eagerly absorbed European techniques for hull design and sail rigging. The result was a new class of vessel that combined the best of both traditions. Adams supervised the construction of 6 more ships, each larger and more advanced than the last. His students spread across Japan, transforming the nation's maritime capabilities. But power attracted jealousy. Assassins stalked the shadows of Adams' compound, sent by merchants whose monopolies he'd broken, or courtiers who resented his influence. Twice he survived poisoning attempts. The skills that had kept him alive at sea now served him in the equally treacherous waters of Japanese politics. Each failed attempt only increased his legend. The foreign samurai seemed protected by powerful spirits. In 1610, Adams reached the peak of his influence. The shogun's youngest son personally requested his tutelage in mathematics and navigation. European princes sent him letters addressed to the Honorable Samurai William Adams, seeking his intervention in trade disputes. His estate had grown to include over 100 households. The shipwright's son from Kent now commanded resources that would have seemed impossible in his apprentice days. Yet in quiet moments, standing in his garden overlooking the harbor where his ships took shape, Adams felt the weight of his extraordinary position. He had become a bridge between worlds, but bridges must bear weight from both sides. The future he was helping to build would transform both his adopted home and the European nations competing for its wealth. Japan was changing, and Anjin-sama stood at the heart of that change, for better or worse, between 2 worlds, the journey of William Adams. The letter from his English wife Mary arrived on a Dutch trading vessel in 1611, crumpled and water-stained from its 2-year journey. As Adams unfolded the paper in his Japanese study, worlds collided. Mary wrote of their son Joseph, now grown, and of London streets Adams hadn't walked in 15 years. She begged him to return home. The ink was smeared with what might have been tears. But home had become a fluid concept. That same morning, Adams had conducted tea ceremony with Osaka's merchant elite, negotiating cotton futures with the subtle language of cup placement and ritual phrases. His daughter Susanna was being courted by a powerful daimyo's son. The English ship that brought Mary's letter carried Captain John Sarris, who found himself bowing awkwardly to his countryman-turned-samurai, needing Adams' influence more than Adams needed his connection to England. Political storms were gathering. The shogunate's Christian persecution had begun, and Adams walked a precarious line. His own Protestant faith provided some protection, but he watched in horror as Japanese Christians were crucified along the Nagasaki road. Some were families he had known, converted by the same Portuguese missionaries who had once tried to condemn him. When Christian insurrections broke out in Shimabara, Adams' council stayed Ieyasu's hand just enough to allow Dutch traders to remain while the Portuguese were expelled. Each European ship brought news that made the shogunate more wary. Spanish conquests in the Philippines, Portuguese expansion in Macau, Dutch aggression in the East Indies, all confirmed the wisdom of Adams' warnings about colonial ambitions. Yet he found himself arguing against the very isolation policies his reports had inspired. Japan needed foreign trade and knowledge, he insisted, but on its own terms. His children straddled the divide. Joseph took after his father, absorbing navigation and mathematics, while Susanna moved effortlessly through the highest levels of Japanese society. Adams wrote of them to Mary, trying to explain how his new family didn't negate his love for his English son. The letters grew fewer as years passed. The weight of lives unlived hung heavy in the silences between continents. In 1616, Adams undertook his most ambitious project, a seafaring academy. Japanese crews trained in European navigation techniques while learning traditional ways of reading wind and wave. He planted the seeds of a maritime tradition that would outlive both isolation and his own influence. His students mapped Japanese coastlines with unprecedented accuracy, creating charts that combined Eastern and Western knowledge into something entirely new. The Dutch East India Company offered him a king's ransom to relocate to Batavia as their master shipwright. The British East India Company countered with an even more generous proposal. But Adams had learned to think like a samurai. Loyalty outweighed profit. His closest Japanese friends understood this better than his European countrymen ever could. As Japan's doors began to close, Adams alone seemed able to hold them open a crack. Trade continued through the narrow window of his influence, each transaction carefully balanced between Western eagerness and Japanese caution. He had become more than a bridge between cultures. He was a filter, processing what could pass between worlds and what must be held back. In his garden, where English roses bloomed beside Japanese cherry trees, Adams created his own small realm of harmony between East and West. But beyond his compound's walls, the future he had helped to shape was taking an unexpected turn. The knowledge he had brought to Japan would survive the coming centuries of isolation, preserved in shipyards and navigation schools that carried his innovations forward in secret. Legacy of the Blue-Eyed Samurai, bridging cultures and isolation. The winter of 1620 brought phantom pains to Adams' old sailing wounds, a navigator's bones remembering storms from decades past. As he wrote his final letters in his seaside estate at Hirado, Japanese warships of his design patrolled the horizon. They were hunting Dutch smugglers in ships that used his innovations, an irony that didn't escape his notice. The student had become the master, and Japan's maritime power had evolved beyond even his expectations. His last great project emerged from a dream of reconciliation. Understanding that Japan's isolation was inevitable, Adams created a hidden archive of Western knowledge. In secret warehouses throughout his estates, he stored technical manuscripts, navigation charts, and detailed shipbuilding plans. These documents, protected by loyal samurai families, would become survival seeds of Western technology, preserved through 2 centuries of seclusion. Japanese scholars would study these papers in secret, keeping alive the spark of innovation until Japan was ready to emerge again. Death came to Adams on May 16, 1620, in his beloved shipyard at Hirado. The mixing of funeral traditions reflected the man himself. Shinto priests chanted alongside Dutch Reformed ministers, while samurai stood guard bearing both katana and English broadswords. His tomb, designed at his request, faced west towards Europe, but was inscribed with Japanese characters. Even in death, he refused to choose between his worlds. The Tokugawa Shogunate's order of isolation fell like a bamboo curtain across Japan in the decades that followed. But Adams' influence ran deep beneath the surface. The Maritime Academy he founded continued in secret, passing knowledge from master to apprentice. Japanese ships built using his methods were officially recorded as traditional designs, while incorporating European innovations in ways that only initiated shipwrights could recognize. His children carried forward different aspects of his legacy. Joseph Adams became Japan's phantom trader, using his father's networks to maintain vital commercial links through the Dutch enclave at Dejima. Susanna's descendants entered the highest ranks of Japanese nobility, their blue eyes appearing occasionally through generations of samurai families, a genetic echo of their remarkable ancestor. In England, Adams became a figure of legend. His letters, finally delivered years after his death, inspired a generation of merchants and adventurers. Shakespeare's company performed a play loosely based on his life, The Tempest's Pilot, though the manuscript was lost in the Globe Theatre fire. His original family home in Gillingham became a place of pilgrimage for ambitious young sailors dreaming of foreign shores. The charts and navigation tables Adams created remained in use by Japanese pilots into the 19th century. When Commodore Perry's Black Ships finally forced Japan's reopening in 1853, he was surprised to find harbor masters using navigational techniques that could only have come from European sources. Adams' hidden legacy had survived, waiting for the moment when Japan would need it again. Modern Japan still bears his fingerprints. The shipyards of Nagasaki and Osaka sit on foundations he helped establish. Maritime academies teach techniques that can be traced back to his innovations. In the city of Yokosuka, where he built his first Japanese vessel, the annual Anjin festival celebrates his memory. Children perform plays about the blue-eyed samurai, while maritime students compete in navigation contests using his methods. Perhaps Adams' greatest legacy was proving that cultural barriers were meant to be bridged, not reinforced. His life demonstrated that knowledge, skill, and loyalty transcended nationality. The shipwright's son from Kent had sailed into legend, transformed himself into a samurai, and changed the course of two nations. In doing so, he created a blueprint for cultural exchange that would outlive Japan's isolation and influence centuries of East-West relations. The bridge builder, William Adams' enduring legacy. Modern container ships dwarf the ancient fortress of Hirado, their steel hulls casting shadows over waters where William Adams once tested his hybrid vessels. In the Harbour Master's office, a computer tracks these maritime giants using GPS technology, but the wall still displays a hand-drawn chart from the 1800s, its measurements taken using techniques Adams introduced to Japan centuries earlier. The influence of the blue-eyed samurai extends far beyond navigation. When Japanese corporations began their post-war expansion into global markets, they studied Adams' methods of cultural adaptation. His approach, maintain your core identity while mastering foreign customs, became a blueprint for Japanese business culture. Toyota's first European factory managers were required to study his letters, learning from a 16th century trader how to bridge Eastern and Western business practices. In 2019, as Emperor Naruhito ascended to Japan's throne, among the imperial treasures was a peculiar artifact, a brass telescope crafted using plans from Adams' personal archives. The instrument, neither fully European nor traditionally Japanese, symbolizes the unique perspective he gave his adopted homeland, a way of looking at the world that combined the best of both cultures. The diplomatic district of Tokyo houses an unmarked garden where Adams' roses still bloom, tended by descendants of his original staff. Nearby, at the Maritime Ministry, modern Japanese naval architects study computer models that trace their lineage to his innovations. When they launch new ships, sake cups are still raised in a ceremony that blends English and Japanese traditions, an echo of ceremonies Adams himself conducted 4 centuries ago. His story resonates particularly today as the world grapples with questions of cultural identity and globalization. Adams showed that adaptation does not mean surrender, that learning foreign ways need not diminish one's own culture. He proved that the most valuable bridges between civilizations are built not by conquering armies or trading companies, but by individuals willing to immerse themselves in another world while maintaining their integrity. The modern Japanese term Anjin spirit refers to someone who can successfully navigate between cultures without losing their way. It's used in international business schools, diplomatic training, and cultural exchange programs. The blue-eyed samurai's greatest legacy may be this: he showed that understanding between cultures, while never easy, is always possible. In the end, Adams built something far more lasting than ships. He created a template for cultural exchange that outlived both Japan's isolation and Europe's colonial ambitions. His life proves that the most powerful forces in history are not the grand schemes of empires, but the choices of individuals who dare to step beyond the boundaries of their world and find humanity in the unknown.